On May 17th, 2008, two identical twin sisters stepped onto one of the busiest motorways in England and walked directly into traffic. What happened next was captured on camera by multiple witnesses and documented by police dashcams, a sequence of events so bizarre, so inexplicable, that it continues to baffle psychologists, law enforcement, and anyone who examines the case more than 15 years later. The women were Sabina and Ursula Eriksson, Swedish twins who were 40 years old and had never been in trouble with the law, who had no history of mental illness, and who, by all accounts, were living ordinary lives before that day. Within hours of their arrival in England, they would be running into speeding vehicles on the M6 motorway. Within days, one of them would be dead, and the other would be responsible for a murder so sudden and violent that it seemed to come from nowhere. This is not a story about premeditated crime. This is not a story about drugs or alcohol. This is a story about two sisters who seem to share something, a delusion, a psychosis, a folie à deux that transformed them from ordinary women into something unrecognizable. And despite all the footage, all the witnesses, all the police reports and psychiatric evaluations, no one has ever been able to fully explain what happened to Sabina and Ursula Eriksson on that spring day in 2008. This is the story of the Eriksson twins. Prologue: Before the Madness. Sabina and Ursula Eriksson were born on November 3rd, 1967 in Sweden. They were identical twins, sharing not just appearance but, according to those who knew them, an unusually close bond. This wasn't the kind of twin connection that becomes the subject of sensational stories. They lived separate lives in different countries and maintained their own identities. But there was always something there, something beneath the surface that connected them in ways that even they might not have fully understood. Ursula was the more settled of the two. She lived in the United States in Florida, where she had built a stable life. She was married with children and worked as a homemaker. Those who knew her described her as calm, responsible, and devoted to her family. There was nothing in her history to suggest instability, no psychiatric treatment, no episodes of unusual behavior. She was by all measures an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. Sabina, on the other hand, had lived a more transient existence. She resided in Mallow, County Cork in Ireland, where she worked and tried to establish herself. She had 2 children from previous relationships, though the details of her personal life were more fragmented than her sister's. But even Sabina, despite a more unsettled lifestyle, had no documented history of mental illness, no hospitalizations, no diagnoses, no indication that she was anything other than a woman trying to navigate life's challenges like anyone else. In May 2008, Sabina traveled from Ireland to Liverpool to visit Ursula, who had flown in from the United States. The plan was simple. The sisters would spend some time together, catch up, perhaps reminisce about their childhood in Sweden. It was supposed to be a normal visit between siblings who didn't see each other often enough. But something went wrong almost immediately. The exact details of what happened in Liverpool remain unclear. Sabina and Ursula stayed with Sabina's ex-partner and his family, but within a day or two, tensions emerged. According to later statements, Sabina's ex-partner became concerned about the twins' behavior. They were acting strangely, paranoid perhaps, or simply off in ways that are difficult to articulate. There were suggestions that they believed someone was following them, that they were in danger, though from what or whom was never made clear. On May 16, 2008, Sabina's ex-partner contacted the police, worried about the twins' state of mind. The police arrived and spoke with Sabina and Ursula, but found no grounds for intervention. The women were not breaking any laws. They were not threatening anyone. They were adults, and they had the right to leave if they wanted to, and that's exactly what they did. Sabina and Ursula left Liverpool, taking their belongings with them. They walked to a nearby bus station and boarded a National Express coach bound for London. No one knows exactly why they chose London. Perhaps they intended to visit someone. Perhaps they were simply trying to get away from whatever they believed was threatening them in Liverpool. Or perhaps there was no rational reason at all. What is known is that they got on that bus, and somewhere along the journey everything began to unravel. Part 1. The M6 Motorway. The National Express coach departed Liverpool around 11:30 a.m. on the morning of May 17th, carrying Sabina and Ursula Eriksson among its passengers. The journey to London should have been straightforward. A few hours on the motorway, a stop or two, and then arrival at Victoria Coach Station. But the twins never made it to London. According to witnesses on the coach, the twins began behaving oddly shortly after departure. They were agitated, restless, whispering to each other in Swedish. Other passengers noticed them looking out the windows repeatedly, as if searching for something or someone. At one point, they asked the driver to let them off the bus. The driver refused. They were on a motorway, and stopping wasn't permitted except at designated rest areas. The twins became more insistent. They demanded to be let off immediately. The driver, sensing something was wrong but unsure what to do, continued driving. The situation escalated. According to later reports, the twins claimed their lives were in danger, that they needed to get off the bus right away. The driver eventually contacted his supervisors and the police, explaining that he had two passengers who were behaving erratically and refusing to calm down. At approximately 1 p.m. on May 17th, the coach pulled into Kiel Services, a rest stop on the M6 motorway in Staffordshire. The driver informed the twins they could disembark there. Sabina and Ursula grabbed their belongings and got off the bus without another word. The coach departed, leaving the twins standing in the service station parking lot. What happened next is partially documented by CCTV footage from the service station and witness statements. The twins spent some time inside the service area, moving through the building in a way that suggested confusion or paranoia. They purchased cigarettes and made phone calls. Sabina tried to reach people she knew, though the content of those conversations is not fully documented. At one point, they approached members of the public asking for help, though what kind of help they needed was unclear even to those they spoke with. Then, sometime after leaving Kiel services, they began walking along the hard shoulder of the M6 motorway. The M6 is one of the busiest motorways in England, carrying tens of thousands of vehicles every day. Walking along its hard shoulder, especially during daylight hours on a busy Saturday, is illegal and extraordinarily dangerous. But Sabina and Ursula walked side by side, heading south, their belongings in hand. It didn't take long for other motorists to notice them. Several drivers called 999, reporting two women walking along the motorway. The police were dispatched immediately. At approximately 3:20 p.m. on May 17, 2008, officers from the Central Motorway Police Group arrived at the scene. What happened next was captured on the dash cam of one of the police vehicles, and the footage is among the most disturbing and perplexing pieces of evidence in the entire case. Part 2. The footage. The dashcam footage begins with the police vehicle approaching the two women from behind. Sabina and Ursula are walking along the hard shoulder, moving at a steady pace, their figures illuminated by the daylight. They are dressed casually, jeans, jackets, and each is carrying a bag. They do not turn around as the police car approaches. They do not acknowledge its presence. They simply continue walking. The police vehicle pulls up alongside them and stops. Two officers exit the car and approach the twins. The officers are calm and professional, asking the women to stop, explaining that they cannot walk on the motorway and that it is dangerous. The footage captures the officers' voices, patient but firm, trying to reason with the twins. Sabina and Ursula do not respond. They do not make eye contact with the officers. They do not speak. They simply stand there side by side, staring straight ahead. One of the officers asks if they speak English. No response. He asks if they are okay. No response. The twins remain silent, motionless, as if they are not fully present in the moment. The officers exchange glances. This is not normal behavior. The women are not intoxicated. There is no smell of alcohol, no slurred speech. They are not visibly injured. But something is clearly wrong. One of the officers places a hand on Ursula's arm, gently trying to guide her toward the police vehicle. And then, without warning, everything changes. Ursula suddenly breaks free and runs directly into the oncoming traffic on the motorway. The footage captures the moment in horrifying clarity. Ursula sprints across the hard shoulder and into the first lane of the motorway, where vehicles are traveling at speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour. A car swerves to avoid her, missing her by inches. She continues into the second lane. Another vehicle brakes hard, tires screeching, and then she reaches the third lane and a car strikes her. The impact is brutal. Ursula is thrown into the air, her body ragdolling across the pavement. She lands in the middle lane, motionless. The officers are stunned. One of them immediately radios for an ambulance, his voice tight with shock and urgency. The other officer turns to Sabina, trying to prevent her from doing the same thing. But Sabina is already moving. Before the officer can react, Sabina runs into the traffic, following her sister. She makes it into the first lane, dodging one car, then another. She reaches the second lane. A lorry, a large articulated truck, is bearing down on her. The driver sees her at the last moment and slams on the brakes, but there is no time. The lorry strikes Sabina head-on. The impact is even more severe than the one that hit Ursula. Sabina is launched through the air, her body twisting as it collides with the front of the truck. She lands on the pavement several meters away and does not move. The motorway descends into chaos. Vehicles screech to a halt. The officers are shouting. An ambulance is en route, but it will take time to arrive. Traffic in both directions is stopped. The scene is one of absolute devastation. And then, impossibly, Sabina begins to move. She pushes herself up off the pavement. Blood is streaming from her head. Her legs are clearly injured. She is limping, dragging one leg behind her, but she is conscious. She is on her feet and she is trying to run again. The officers rush toward her, shouting at her to stay down, to stop moving, but Sabina does not stop. She stumbles forward, away from them, her movements erratic and uncoordinated. One of the officers catches up to her and tries to restrain her. Sabina fights back, screaming, thrashing, trying to break free. It takes both officers to subdue her. They manage to get her onto the ground, holding her there as she continues to struggle. She is screaming in Swedish, words that the officers cannot understand. Her strength is shocking given the injuries she has just sustained. It is as if she is not fully human in that moment, as if something else is driving her. Behind them, Ursula is still lying in the road. Paramedics arrive and rush to her side. She is unconscious but alive. Somehow, against all odds, she has survived being struck by a car traveling at high speed. Sabina is eventually restrained and placed in an ambulance. She is still screaming, still fighting. The paramedics struggle to keep her still long enough to assess her injuries. She has suffered severe trauma, head injuries, leg injuries, possible internal bleeding, but she is alive. Both twins are transported to the University Hospital of North Staffordshire. The police are left at the scene, trying to process what they have just witnessed. The footage from the dash cam will later be reviewed by investigators, psychologists, and journalists, and every single person who watches it will come away with the same question. What were they thinking? Part 3. The Hospital. Sabina and Ursula were taken to separate areas of the hospital. Both were in critical condition, though their injuries, while severe, were not immediately life-threatening. Ursula had sustained multiple fractures and a head injury. Sabina's injuries were more extensive. She had broken bones, lacerations, and significant trauma to her skull. The fact that either of them had survived was remarkable. The fact that both had survived was almost unbelievable. The medical staff were briefed on the circumstances of the twins' arrival. They were informed that the women had deliberately run into traffic, that they had been behaving erratically, and that they might pose a danger to themselves or others. Psychiatric evaluations would be necessary, but first, the immediate medical concerns had to be addressed. Ursula remained unconscious for some time after arrival. When she eventually regained consciousness, she was disoriented and confused. She did not seem to remember what had happened on the motorway. The medical staff attempted to speak with her, but she was largely unresponsive, drifting in and out of lucidity. She was placed under observation, both for her physical injuries and for her mental state. Sabina, on the other hand, was conscious almost immediately, and she was combative. Despite her severe injuries, Sabina fought against the medical staff who were trying to treat her. She screamed, kicked, and tried to pull away from the doctors and nurses. She spoke in Swedish, and while some staff members attempted to communicate with her in English, she either did not understand or refused to respond. At one point, she managed to pull out her own IV line, causing blood to spray across the floor. It took several members of staff to restrain her long enough to sedate her. Even after sedation, Sabina remained agitated. Her behavior was so extreme that the hospital staff contacted psychiatric services requesting an urgent evaluation. It was clear that something was profoundly wrong with both women, but the nature of that wrongness was difficult to define. Over the next several hours, both twins were stabilized. Their physical injuries were treated, and they were kept under close observation. The police, meanwhile, were trying to piece together what had happened. They reviewed the dashcam footage. They spoke with the coach driver and the passengers who had been on the bus with the twins. They contacted Sabina's ex-partner in Liverpool, who confirmed that the twins had been acting strangely before they left. But none of it made sense. There was no clear motive for the twins' behavior. They had no history of mental illness. They had not been drinking or taking drugs. Toxicology reports would later confirm this. They had no reason to be suicidal, at least none that anyone could identify. And yet they had run into traffic with what appeared to be full intent to harm themselves. The term folie à deux began to circulate among the investigators and medical staff. Folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, is a rare condition in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one individual to another, usually between people who are closely related or who have a strong emotional bond. It is most commonly seen in twins, siblings, or spouses. The condition can manifest suddenly and without warning, and it can cause those affected to engage in behaviors that are completely out of character. If Sabina and Ursula were experiencing folie à deux, it would explain the synchronicity of their actions, the way they had both run into traffic, the way they had both seemed to be operating under the same delusion, but it did not explain what that delusion was or what had triggered it. By the morning of May 18th, Ursula's condition had improved enough that she was deemed stable. She was still confused and disoriented, but she was no longer in immediate physical danger. Sabina, however, was a different story. Her injuries were more severe, and her mental state was deeply concerning. The psychiatric team evaluated her and concluded that she was experiencing an acute psychotic episode. They recommended that she be detained under the Mental Health Act for her own safety. But there was a problem. The hospital was not equipped to hold Sabina long-term. She needed to be transferred to a psychiatric facility where she could receive proper care. However, because of the severity of her physical injuries, she could not be moved immediately. She would need to remain in the hospital for at least another day or two while her condition stabilized. And so Sabina remained in the hospital under observation, sedated but still occasionally combative. Ursula was moved to a different ward, where she continued to recover. The two sisters were kept apart. Hospital staff believed it was best to separate them, given the strange synchronicity of their behavior. Sabina was kept in the hospital for approximately 5 hours before being deemed fit enough to leave medical care. Her injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening, and the doctors believed she could continue her recovery elsewhere. The plan was to transfer her to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment, but that transfer never happened. Instead, Sabina was arrested. The police had decided to charge her with a criminal offense. The specific charge was trespass on a railway, essentially the legal equivalent of walking on the motorway. It was a minor charge, one that would normally result in a fine or a caution, but it meant that Sabina would be taken into police custody rather than being transferred to a psychiatric hospital. This decision would prove to be catastrophic. Part 4. The Custody. Sabina Eriksson was taken from the hospital to Stoke-on-Trent Custody Suite on the afternoon of May 17, 2008. She was still injured. Her head was bandaged, her leg was in a brace, and she was walking with difficulty. But the police determined that she was fit to be held in custody while they processed the charges against her. The custody suite was a standard holding facility designed to house individuals who had been arrested and were awaiting either release or transfer to court. It was not equipped to handle individuals with severe psychiatric conditions. Sabina was placed in a cell, and a custody sergeant was assigned to monitor her. The records from the custody suite show that Sabina was checked on regularly throughout her detention. She was offered food and water, which she refused. She was asked if she needed medical attention, which she also refused. She was largely silent, sitting on the bench in her cell, staring at the wall. The custody staff noted that she seemed withdrawn and unresponsive, but not overtly aggressive or dangerous. At some point during her detention, a psychiatric nurse was called to evaluate Sabina. The nurse spoke with her briefly, attempting to assess her mental state. Sabina responded to some questions but remained largely uncommunicative. The nurse concluded that while Sabina was clearly experiencing some level of psychological distress, she did not pose an immediate risk to herself or others. The nurse recommended that Sabina be monitored closely but did not recommend transferring her to a psychiatric facility at that time. This assessment would later be heavily criticized. In hindsight, it is clear that Sabina was in the midst of a severe psychotic episode, one that should have been immediately apparent to anyone evaluating her. But in the moment, in the confines of a busy custody suite, the signs were missed or misinterpreted. Sabina remained in custody overnight. According to the records, she slept fitfully, occasionally pacing her cell or sitting on the bench. The custody staff continued to check on her at regular intervals. There were no incidents, no outbursts, no signs of the violence that was about to come. On the morning of May 19, 2008, Sabina appeared before a magistrate via video link. The charge against her, trespass on a railway, was read out, and the magistrate asked if she understood the charges. Sabina did not respond. The magistrate asked again, still no response. After several attempts to communicate with her, the magistrate decided to release her with a caution. The charge was not serious enough to warrant further detention, and given Sabina's lack of prior criminal history, it was deemed appropriate to let her go. At approximately 3 p.m. on May 19, 2008, Sabina Eriksson was released from custody. She was given back her personal belongings, her bag, her phone, her identification. She was provided with information about local support services and told that she was free to leave. And she walked out of the custody suite alone onto the streets of Stoke-on-Trent. Less than 24 hours later, a man named Glenn Hollinshead would be dead. Part 5. Glenn Hollinshead. Glenn Hollinshead was 54 years old. He lived in the Fenton area of Stoke-on-Trent, a modest neighborhood where he had spent most of his life. He was described by those who knew him as a kind and gentle man, someone who would go out of his way to help others. He was not wealthy. He did not have a high-profile job. He was just a man trying to live his life, taking care of his elderly parents and getting by as best he could. On the evening of May 19th, 2008, after Sabina had been released from custody, she spent hours wandering the streets of Stoke-on-Trent. Witnesses reported seeing her walking through various neighborhoods, appearing disoriented and distressed. She was still visibly injured. She was limping, her head was bandaged, and she appeared confused. At some point during the evening or early morning hours, Sabina encountered Glenn Hollinshead. Exactly how and when they met is not entirely clear. Some reports suggest that Sabina approached him asking for help. Others suggest that Glenn, seeing a woman who appeared to be injured and distressed, offered assistance. What is certain is that on the morning of May 20th, 2008, the two of them were together, heading in the direction of Glenn's home. Witnesses later reported seeing Glenn and Sabina together in the Fenton area on the morning of May 20th. Sabina was still visibly injured. She was limping, her head was bandaged, and she appeared disoriented. Glenn, by all accounts, was trying to help her. Perhaps he intended to take her to a hospital. Perhaps he was planning to call someone on her behalf. Or perhaps he simply wanted to make sure she had somewhere safe to go. They arrived at Glenn's home, a modest house on a quiet street. What happened next can only be partially reconstructed from the evidence that was later found at the scene. At some point, while inside or near Glenn's home, Sabina attacked him. The attack was sudden and brutal. Sabina struck Glenn multiple times with a weapon. later determined to be a roof tile that she had picked up from outside the house. She hit him in the head, over and over, with enough force to fracture his skull. Glenn, caught completely off guard, had no chance to defend himself. He collapsed, bleeding heavily from the wounds to his head. Sabina then took a knife from Glenn's kitchen. She stabbed him 5 times in the chest and abdomen. The wounds were deep and vicious, inflicted with such force that the knife penetrated vital organs. Glenn Hollinshead died within minutes. After killing Glenn, Sabina left the house. She walked out onto the street, still holding the knife covered in blood. She did not run. She did not try to hide. She simply walked, moving in no particular direction, as if in a trance. Witnesses saw her almost immediately. One neighbor, horrified by the sight of a blood-soaked woman walking down the street with a knife in her hand, called the police. Other residents came out of their homes, unsure what they were seeing, but instinctively keeping their distance. The police arrived within minutes. Officers approached Sabina, ordering her to drop the knife. She did not respond. She did not acknowledge their presence. She simply stood there, the knife still in her hand, blood dripping onto the pavement. One of the officers moved closer, speaking to her calmly, trying to get her to put the knife down. Sabina looked at him, her expression blank, as if she did not understand what he was saying. And then, without warning, she raised the knife and plunged it into her own abdomen. The officers rushed forward, wresting the knife away from her before she could stab herself again. Sabina collapsed, blood now pouring from the self-inflicted wound in her stomach. An ambulance was called, and she was rushed back to the hospital, the same hospital she had been discharged from just days earlier. Meanwhile, other officers entered Glenn Hollinshead's home. They found his body in the hallway, surrounded by a pool of blood. The scene was horrific. Glenn had been beaten and stabbed with such ferocity that it was clear the attack had been frenzied, chaotic, and utterly senseless. Glenn Hollinshead, a man who had done nothing but try to help a stranger in distress, was dead, and the woman who killed him was once again in police custody, this time charged with murder. Part 6. The Investigation. The investigation into Glenn Hollinshead's murder began immediately. Detectives from Staffordshire Police launched a full inquiry, determined to understand what had happened and why. The evidence was overwhelming. Sabina Eriksson had been seen by multiple witnesses, covered in blood, holding the murder weapon. There was no question that she had killed Glenn. The question was, why? Detectives reviewed everything they knew about Sabina and her sister. They re-examined the footage from the M6 motorway. They spoke with the medical staff at the hospital, the custody officers who had held Sabina, and the psychiatric nurse who had evaluated her. They contacted authorities in Ireland and the United States, gathering information about the twins' backgrounds and any history of mental illness. What they found was baffling. There was no history of violence, no prior criminal activity, no documented psychiatric conditions. Sabina and Ursula had been ordinary women, living ordinary lives, until that day in May 2008. And yet, in the span of less than 72 hours, They had engaged in a series of actions that defied all rational explanation. The detectives also spoke with Glenn Hollinshead's family and neighbors. Everyone described Glenn as a good man, someone who would never harm anyone. There was no connection between Glenn and Sabina. They had never met before that day. There was no motive, no robbery, no argument, no provocation. Sabina had simply killed him, seemingly at random. Forensic evidence from the scene confirmed the brutality of the attack. Glenn had been struck in the head at least 5 times with the roof tile. He had been stabbed 5 times in the chest and abdomen. The level of violence suggested a frenzied, uncontrolled assault, consistent with someone in the midst of a severe psychotic episode. Sabina herself was unable to provide any answers. After being treated for the self-inflicted stab wound, she was placed in a secure psychiatric facility where she would remain while awaiting trial. Psychiatrists evaluated her extensively, trying to understand her mental state at the time of the murder. The consensus among the psychiatric experts was clear. Sabina had been experiencing an acute psychotic episode. She had been delusional, disconnected from reality, and incapable of rational thought. The exact nature of her delusions was difficult to determine. She was largely uncommunicative during the evaluations, and when she did speak, her statements were fragmented and incoherent. One of the psychiatrists involved in her evaluation later described Sabina's condition as one of the most severe cases of brief psychotic disorder he had ever encountered. The disorder had come on suddenly, with no prior warning, and it had driven her to commit an act of extreme violence. And then, just as suddenly, it had begun to lift. By the time Sabina was evaluated several weeks after the murder, she was no longer psychotic. She was lucid, coherent, and fully aware of where she was and what she had done. She expressed deep remorse for Glenn's death, though she claimed to have no memory of the attack itself. She said she remembered leaving the custody suite, and she remembered walking through Fenton, but everything after that was a blank. This lack of memory is consistent with dissociative states that can occur during severe psychotic episodes. The mind, overwhelmed by delusions and hallucinations, essentially shuts down the ability to form coherent memories. Sabina's account was credible from a psychiatric standpoint, but it offered no insight into what had driven her to kill Glenn Hollinshead. Meanwhile, Ursula had been released from the hospital and had returned to the United States. She was interviewed by police as part of the investigation, but she was not considered a suspect in Glenn's murder. She had been in the hospital at the time of the killing, and there was no evidence linking her to the crime. However, her role in the events on the M6 motorway remained a key piece of the puzzle. Detectives asked Ursula to explain what had happened that day, why she and Sabina had run into traffic. Ursula's responses were vague and contradictory. She claimed she could not remember much about that afternoon, that she had been confused and disoriented. She said she and Sabina had believed they were in danger, though she could not explain what that danger was or why they had felt that way. Some investigators suspected that Ursula was withholding information, that she knew more than she was willing to admit. But there was no way to compel her to cooperate. She was a foreign national living abroad, and she had not committed any crime herself. Ursula returned to her life in Florida, and the investigation moved forward without her full participation. As the months passed, the focus shifted entirely to Sabina. She was charged with the murder of Glenn Hollinshead and with causing grievous bodily harm to herself. The question of her mental state at the time of the murder would be central to the trial. Under English law, a person can be found not guilty of a crime by reason of insanity if it can be proven that they were suffering from a mental disorder at the time of the offense, and that this disorder prevented them from understanding the nature or wrongfulness of their actions. Given the psychiatric evaluations, it seemed likely that Sabina would pursue this defense. But Sabina's legal team made a different decision. They chose to plead guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility rather than pursuing a full insanity defense. This plea acknowledged that Sabina had killed Glenn, but that her mental state at the time had significantly impaired her ability to control her actions. The prosecution accepted the plea. The evidence clearly supported the conclusion that Sabina had been in the midst of a severe psychotic episode. There was no question of premeditation or intent. The trial, therefore, would focus on determining an appropriate sentence. Part 7. The Trial. Sabina Eriksson's trial began on September 1, 2009, more than a year after Glenn Hollinshead's murder. On September 2, 2009, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The proceedings were held at Nottingham Crown Court, and the case attracted significant media attention. The story of the Eriksson twins had already been widely reported. The dashcam footage from the M6 motorway had been broadcast on television, and the bizarre circumstances of the case had captured public fascination. The courtroom was packed with journalists, members of the public, and Glenn Hollinshead's family. Glenn's relatives sat in the gallery, their faces etched with grief and confusion. They had lost a beloved family member in the most senseless way imaginable, and they were there to see justice served. Sabina appeared in court looking very different from the wild, blood-soaked figure who had been arrested on the streets of Fenton. She was calm, composed, and neatly dressed. She sat quietly in the dock, her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank. To those who saw her, she seemed like a completely different person. The prosecution outlined the facts of the case. They described the events on the M6 motorway, the twins' behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and the brutal attack on Glenn Hollinshead. They presented forensic evidence, witness statements, and the psychiatric evaluations. The picture they painted was one of a woman in the grip of a severe mental breakdown, someone who had been completely disconnected from reality. The defense did not dispute any of the facts. Their argument was straightforward. Sabina Eriksson had been suffering from an acute psychotic episode at the time of the murder. She had not been in control of her actions. She had not intended to kill Glenn Hollinshead. She had been driven by delusions and hallucinations that she could not understand or resist. The psychiatric experts testified, explaining the nature of brief psychotic disorder and how it can manifest suddenly without warning. They described how individuals experiencing such episodes can engage in violent or self-destructive behavior that is completely out of character. They emphasized that Sabina had no prior history of violence, no history of mental illness, and no apparent motive for the murder. One of the experts also discussed the phenomenon of folie à deux, suggesting that Sabina and Ursula may have been experiencing a shared psychotic episode. He explained that in such cases, the delusions can be transmitted from one individual to another, often with devastating consequences. He noted that the synchronicity of the twins' behavior on the motorway strongly suggested that they had been operating under the same delusional framework. The prosecution did not challenge the psychiatric evidence. They agreed that Sabina had been mentally ill at the time of the murder, but they argued that this did not absolve her of responsibility entirely. Glenn Hollinshead was dead, and someone had to be held accountable. Glenn's family also gave victim impact statements describing the devastating effect his death had had on their lives. They spoke of Glenn's kindness, his generosity, and his willingness to help others. They said that Glenn had died because he had tried to help a stranger, and that his death was a tragedy that should never have happened. Sabina's defense team presented their own statement, read by her solicitor. In it, Sabina expressed deep remorse for what she had done. She said she could not explain why she had killed Glenn, that she had no memory of the attack, but that she would carry the guilt of his death for the rest of her life. She apologized to Glenn's family, though she knew no apology could ever undo what had happened. The sentencing took place on November 25, 2009. The judge, Mr. Justice Saunders, listened to all the evidence and statements. He acknowledged the complexity of the case and the genuine tragedy it represented. He noted that Sabina had been seriously mentally ill at the time of the murder, and that this had to be taken into account when determining her sentence. But he also noted that Glenn Hollinshead had been an innocent victim, a man who had done nothing wrong and who had died in a horrific and violent manner. The judge said that while Sabina's mental illness was a mitigating factor, it did not eliminate her culpability. On November 25, 2009, Sabina Eriksson was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the manslaughter of Glenn Hollinshead. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, given the brutality of the crime. Others felt it was appropriate, given the clear evidence of Sabina's mental illness at the time of the offense. Glenn's family expressed frustration and disappointment. They felt that the sentence did not reflect the magnitude of their loss, but they also acknowledged that no sentence could ever bring Glenn back or ease their pain. Sabina was led away from the courtroom to begin her sentence. She would serve her time in a secure psychiatric facility, where she would continue to receive treatment for her mental health. And with that, the legal proceedings came to an end, but the questions remained. Part 8: Aftermath and Theories. Sabina Eriksson was released from custody in 2011, having served approximately half of her 5-year sentence. Under the terms of her release, she was deported to Sweden, where she would continue to receive psychiatric treatment and monitoring. Upon her return to Sweden, Sabina largely disappeared from public view. She did not give interviews. She did not speak publicly about what had happened. Those who knew her said she was living quietly, trying to rebuild her life away from the scrutiny and trauma of the previous years. She maintained contact with her children, though the details of those relationships remained private. Ursula Eriksson also retreated from the public eye. She returned to her life in Florida, and according to reports, she too refused to discuss the events of May 2008. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, and did not respond to inquiries from journalists or researchers. The bond between the twins, once so close that they had apparently shared a psychotic delusion, seemed to have been irrevocably damaged by what had happened. In the years following the trial, the case of the Eriksson twins became the subject of intense analysis and speculation. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts all attempted to understand what had happened and why. The BBC aired a documentary titled Madness in the Fast Lane in 2010, which featured the dashcam footage from the M6 motorway and interviews with police officers, medical professionals, and witnesses. The documentary brought the case to an even wider audience and sparked renewed debate about the nature of the twins' behavior. Several theories emerged to explain what had happened to Sabina and Ursula Eriksson. The folie à deux theory. This remains the most widely accepted explanation among psychiatric professionals. Folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, occurs when a delusional belief system is transmitted from one individual to another who is closely bonded with them. It is most commonly seen in identical twins who share not only genetic makeup but often intense psychological connections. The theory suggests that one of the twins, most likely Sabina, given her more unstable life circumstances, began experiencing a psychotic episode, possibly triggered by stress or some unknown factor. Ursula, being so closely connected to her sister, absorbed these delusions and began to believe them as well. This would explain why both twins exhibited the same bizarre behavior, running into traffic at the same time, seemingly operating under the same delusional framework. However, folie à deux typically requires prolonged contact between the affected individuals. Sabina and Ursula had only been together for a day or two before the incident on the motorway. While not impossible, it would be unusual for such a condition to develop so rapidly. Some experts have suggested that the twins may have had an underlying predisposition to shared delusions, something rooted in their twin bond that made them particularly susceptible. The paranoid delusion theory. According to statements made to the police and to the bus driver, the twins believed they were in danger. They thought someone was following them or threatening them. This suggests they were experiencing paranoid delusions, false beliefs that they were being persecuted or pursued. Paranoid delusions are a common feature of acute psychotic episodes. They can develop suddenly and can cause individuals to engage in erratic and dangerous behavior in an attempt to escape the perceived threat. If Sabina and Ursula both believed they were being chased or hunted, it might explain why they were so desperate to get off the bus, why they walked along the motorway despite the danger, and why they ran into traffic. Perhaps they believed the vehicles were part of the threat, or perhaps they were trying to escape at any cost. But this theory leaves questions unanswered. What triggered these delusions? Why did both twins experience them simultaneously? And why, after surviving the motorway incident, did Sabina's psychosis manifest as violence toward a stranger? The drug or toxin theory. Some skeptics have suggested that the twins must have been under the influence of drugs or some other substance. The behavior was so extreme, so divorced from reality, that it seemed impossible for it to have occurred without some external chemical influence. However, toxicology reports conducted on both twins after the motorway incident found no evidence of drugs or alcohol in their systems. No trace of hallucinogens, stimulants, or any other substance that could explain their behavior. This theory has been largely discredited by the medical evidence, though some conspiracy theorists continue to suggest that the twins may have been exposed to an unknown substance that was not tested for. The folie imposée theory. A variation on the folie à deux theory, folie imposée, suggests that one twin, the dominant personality, imposed her delusions on the other, who was more passive or suggestible. Once the dominant twin was removed from the situation, the passive twin's delusions would fade. This theory is supported by the fact that Ursula's psychosis seemed to resolve relatively quickly after she was separated from Sabina in the hospital. Within days, Ursula was lucid and communicative, while Sabina remained deeply psychotic. This suggests that Sabina may have been the primary source of the delusions, and that Ursula was swept up in them due to their close bond. However, this theory does not explain why Sabina became violent after the motorway incident, or why she killed Glenn Hollinshead. If her psychosis was part of a shared delusion with her sister, why did it persist and escalate after Ursula was no longer present? The trauma and stress theory. Some psychologists have suggested that the twins may have been dealing with significant stress or trauma that triggered a sudden mental breakdown. Perhaps something had happened in their personal lives, family issues, relationship problems, financial stress, that pushed them over the edge. There is some circumstantial evidence to support this. Sabina's life in Ireland had been unstable, and she had children from previous relationships. Ursula had traveled from the United States to visit her, which may have been prompted by some crisis. The tensions that arose during their stay in Liverpool suggest that something was wrong, though what exactly remains unclear. But even if stress was a factor, it does not fully explain the synchronized nature of their psychosis or the extreme violence of Sabina's actions. The possession or supernatural theory. Among the more fringe explanations are those that invoke supernatural or paranormal causes. Some have suggested that the twins were possessed by some malevolent force, or that they were under the influence of a curse or spiritual attack. These theories are not taken seriously by medical or legal professionals, but they persist in certain corners of the internet and among those who believe the case defies rational explanation. There is, of course, no credible evidence for any supernatural involvement. The case is disturbing and unusual, but it is not beyond the realm of psychiatric explanation. Part 9. The questions that remain. Despite all the analysis, all the expert testimony, all the psychiatric evaluations, there are questions about the Eriksson twins case that remain unanswered. What triggered the psychotic episode? This is perhaps the most fundamental question. Sabina and Ursula had no documented history of mental illness. They were 40 years old, an unusual age for a first psychotic episode to occur. Something must have triggered it, but what? Was it stress, trauma, a genetic predisposition that had lain dormant until that moment, or was it something else entirely, some combination of factors that created the perfect storm for a shared psychotic break? The truth is, no one knows. The twins themselves have offered no real explanation, and the people who knew them could point to no obvious cause. It remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Why did Sabina kill Glenn Hollinshead? Even if we accept that Sabina was in the midst of a severe psychotic episode, the murder of Glenn Hollinshead is difficult to understand. Psychotic individuals can be violent, but such violence is usually directed at people they perceive as threats or who feature in their delusions. Glenn was a stranger who was trying to help Sabina. There is no indication that he did anything to provoke her or that he represented a threat in her delusional framework. Some psychiatrists have suggested that Glenn may have inadvertently triggered something in Sabina's disturbed mind. Perhaps he said something or did something that her psychotic brain interpreted as threatening. Or perhaps the act of violence was completely random, a manifestation of the chaos inside her mind with no rational explanation at all. Sabina herself claims to have no memory of the attack, which is consistent with dissociative states during psychotic episodes. But this means we will likely never know what, if anything, went through her mind in those final moments before she killed Glenn. What did Ursula really experience? Ursula Eriksson has remained almost completely silent about what happened. She gave limited statements to police, and she has never spoken publicly about the events of May 2008. This silence has led to speculation and criticism. Some people believe Ursula knows more than she has said, that she is hiding something or protecting herself from scrutiny. But it is also possible that Ursula genuinely does not remember much of what happened, or that her memories are fragmented and unreliable. Psychotic episodes can cause significant memory impairment, and the head injury she sustained when she was struck by the car may have further complicated her ability to recall events. What did Ursula believe when she ran into traffic? Did she think she was escaping from danger? Did she think the vehicles were something other than what they were? Or was she simply following her sister, driven by an instinct to stay together no matter what? We may never know. Ursula has chosen silence, and that is her right. But her silence means that half of the story, the half that might explain the shared nature of the delusions, remains untold. Could this happen again? This is the question that haunts many people who study the case. If two apparently normal women could suddenly descend into shared psychosis and commit acts of extreme violence, could it happen to anyone? Could it happen again? The psychiatric community generally agrees that cases like this are extremely rare. Folie à deux itself is uncommon, and violent manifestations of it are rarer still. The specific combination of factors that led to the Eriksson twins' breakdown, the twin bond, the sudden onset, the severity of the delusions, is unlikely to be replicated exactly. But the case does highlight the fragility of the human mind. It shows that even people with no history of mental illness, no apparent risk factors, can experience sudden and catastrophic breakdowns. It is a sobering reminder that we do not fully understand the brain or the conditions that can cause it to malfunction. Was justice served? This question has been debated extensively, particularly by Glenn Hollinshead's family. Sabina Eriksson served 5 years for killing a man in a brutal and horrific manner. Some people believe this was too lenient, that mental illness should not be used as an excuse for murder. Others argue that Sabina was genuinely not in control of her actions, that she was as much a victim of her illness as Glenn was a victim of her violence. They point out that she had no prior history of violence, that she was clearly mentally ill at the time of the offense, and that punishing her more harshly would serve no purpose. There is no easy answer. The justice system did what it could with the information available. The sentence reflected the psychiatric evidence and the specific circumstances of the case. But for Glenn's family, no sentence could ever be enough. Their loved one is gone, and no amount of justice can bring him back. Part 10. The Legacy. The case of the Eriksson twins has left a lasting impact on everyone it touched. For Glenn Hollinshead's family, it remains a source of unending grief. They lost a kind and gentle man in the most senseless way imaginable, and they have had to live with that loss every day since. For the police officers who responded to the Motorway incident, the case remains one of the most disturbing they ever encountered. The dashcam footage, with its images of 2 women running into traffic and surviving impacts that should have killed them, is seared into their memories. Several officers involved in the case have spoken about the psychological toll it took on them, the way it challenged their understanding of human behavior. For the medical and psychiatric professionals who treated the twins, the case represents a rare and extreme example of how quickly and dramatically the mind can break down. It has been studied in psychiatric journals and discussed in medical schools as an example of acute psychotic disorder and folie à dire. But even the experts admit that they do not fully understand what happened. For the public, the case remains a source of fascination and horror. The footage from the motorway has been viewed millions of times online. Documentaries about the case continue to be made and watched. People are drawn to it because it represents something deeply unsettling. The idea that two ordinary women could, in a matter of hours, become unrecognizable, dangerous, and ultimately tragic figures. And for Sabina and Ursula Eriksson themselves, the case is a permanent scar. Both women have retreated from public life, and there is no indication that they will ever speak publicly about what happened. They live with the knowledge of what they did, the pain they caused, and the mystery that surrounds them. In 2013, a journalist attempted to track down Sabina Eriksson in Sweden, hoping to secure an interview. The journalist was unsuccessful, but did manage to confirm that Sabina was living quietly, receiving ongoing psychiatric care, and attempting to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. She was described as deeply traumatized by the events of 2008, and those close to her said she remained haunted by the memory of Glenn Hollinshead's death, even though she could not remember the act itself. Ursula has been even more elusive. Reports suggest she remains in the United States, living with her family, and has refused all contact with media or researchers. Some sources claim that Ursula and Sabina have not spoken since the events of 2008, that the shared trauma of what happened has driven them apart rather than bringing them closer together. The case has also raised important questions about how the criminal justice system handles individuals with severe mental illness. Critics have pointed out that Sabina should never have been released from police custody after the motorway incident, that it was obvious she was in the midst of a psychiatric crisis. If she had been transferred to a psychiatric facility instead of being charged with a minor offense and released, Glenn Hollinshead might still be alive. In response to the case, there have been calls for better training for police officers and custody staff in recognizing and responding to mental health emergencies. There have also been discussions about the need for more secure psychiatric facilities and better coordination between the criminal justice system and mental health services. But these are systemic issues that go far beyond a single case. The Eriksson twins represent an extreme and unusual example, but they highlight broader problems in how society deals with mental illness, particularly when it manifests suddenly and violently. Epilogue: The unknowable. In the end, the case of the Eriksson twins remains deeply unsettling precisely because it resists easy explanation. We have the footage, we have the witness statements, we have the medical reports and the psychiatric evaluations. We have everything we need to understand what happened, except the one thing that matters most. Why? Why did two ordinary women suddenly descend into shared madness? Why did they run into traffic with apparent disregard for their own lives? Why did Sabina, after surviving an impact that should have killed her, go on to murder a man who was trying to help her? The psychiatric explanations are credible and well supported by evidence, but they are also, in some sense, incomplete. They describe what happened to the twins' minds, but they do not explain the deeper why. The spark that ignited the madness, the specific content of the delusions, the reason Glenn Hollinshead became the target of that madness. Perhaps there is no deeper why. Perhaps the human mind, for all its complexity and wonder, is ultimately fragile and unpredictable. Perhaps what happened to Sabina and Ursula Eriksson was nothing more than a tragic accident of brain chemistry, a random misfiring of neurons that created a delusion so powerful it drove them to acts of self-destruction and violence. Or perhaps there is something more, something we do not yet understand about the nature of consciousness, the bond between twins, the way the mind can break under certain conditions. Perhaps the truth is hiding somewhere in the silence maintained by the twins themselves, locked away in memories they cannot or will not share. What is certain is that on May 17, 2008, something inexplicable happened on the M6 motorway. 2 women walked into traffic and survived, and in the aftermath of that survival, one of them committed an act of violence that ended an innocent man's life and forever altered the lives of everyone involved. The dashcam footage remains, the court documents remain, the memories of those who witnessed the events remain, but the truth, the full, complete truth of what happened inside the minds of Sabina and Ursula Eriksson may never be known. And perhaps that is the most disturbing thing of all. The case of the Eriksson twins stands as one of the most bizarre and tragic incidents in modern British criminal history. It is a case that defies simple categorization. It is not a typical true crime story, not a straightforward mystery, not even a clear-cut example of mental illness and its consequences. It is instead a glimpse into the darkest and most unknowable corners of the human mind. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, beneath the routines and rationality that we take for granted, there exists the possibility of sudden and catastrophic breakdown. It is a reminder that we do not fully understand ourselves, our brains, or the bonds that connect us to others. Glenn Hollinshead's death was a tragedy that should never have happened. He was a good man who tried to help someone in need, and he paid for that kindness with his life. His family continues to mourn him, and his memory serves as a reminder of the random and senseless nature of violence. Sabina Eriksson served her sentence and lives now with the knowledge of what she did, even if she cannot remember the act itself. Ursula Eriksson survived her injuries and returned to her life, carrying with her the memories of a day when she and her sister ran into traffic for reasons no one can fully explain. And the rest of us are left with questions. Questions about what triggers madness. Questions about the nature of shared delusions. Questions about how 2 ordinary women could become, for a brief and terrible moment, something other than themselves. The footage exists, The facts are documented, the case is closed, but the mystery remains. Sleep well, if you can.